The second of the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, HMS Warspite would end up as the most well-known of her class. Probably the most well-known of any Royal Navy battleship, excepting maybe Dreadnought herself. When she was laid down and launched, it certainly wouldn't have seemed that way. Warspite would end up exceeding every reasonable expectation put on her, and quite a few beyond that as well. The sixth ship of her name, a name stretching back to the Tudor fleet, Warspite was laid down on October 31st, 1912. Her launch on November 26, 1913 was pretty standard and nothing to write home about. Her commissioning, on the other hand, took place on March 8, 1915, with the Great War in full swing. As the second of the Queen Elizabeth class, Warspite was, by extension, the second fast battleship by common understanding, and the second battleship armed with 15-inch guns. That combination of speed and firepower, and it must be said, heavy armor as well, made her one of the most powerful warships on Earth at the time. Not that one would know it, looking at her initial service. She picked up something of a trend for ramming things. Things she wasn't supposed to ram, such as the seabed, or her sister, HMS Barham, the latter of which dealing severe enough damage to both ships to keep them out of action until late December 1915, the ramming having happened in early December. Not a particularly auspicious start to her career, I suppose, but Warspite would soon have the chance to prove herself, and start her trend of going above and beyond, for that matter. That chance being, of course, the Battle of Jutland, where, it must be said, her luck continued to be absolutely terrible, for all that her service in that action became legendary. It started simply enough, with Warspite and the rest of the 5th Battle Squadron, then consisting of all of the QEs except for the nameship, sailing in support of the British battlecruisers. However, thanks to pretty typical, for him anyway, signaling issues on the part of Beatty, the ships lagged behind and missed the initial engagement. This both aided the Germans in dealing the losses on the battlecruisers they pulled off, and ended up in 5th Battle Squadron having to face down basically the entire High Seas fleet at one point. 3 out of 4 of the British battleships, HMS Valiant being the lucky exception, took varying degrees of damage here, none more so than Warspite. You see, while Warspite would succeed in hitting SMS Von der Tann, and later SMS Markgraf, she would take one particular hit in return. SMS Kaiser, most likely, being the ship to deal the blow that would haunt Warspite for the rest of her career. That single hit slammed into her port engine room and jammed her steering gear. Instead of stopping for repairs, which carried its own risks to be fair, the captain decided to keep her moving right along, at full speed. With her rudder jammed, however, she would do as Bismarck would decades later. Steer in a big circle that brought her right into the guns of the enemy. Warspite would make 2 circles before her steering gear was sorted enough to get under control. During this, she would be pounded repeatedly by the German fleet, as she was quite an inviting target. One of the best and newest of the Royal Navy's battleships circling right at you? I can imagine what the Germans were thinking. Soaking up all of this damage did, completely by accident, save the armored cruiser HMS Warrior, though. The Germans stopped firing at her in favor of the bigger target, and the crew of Warrior, taken off their sinking ship later, were quite thankful for what they had seen as a deliberate action to save them, not the motions of an out-of-control ship circling around as her crew tried to figure out the rudder issues. Once Warspite did get her steering situated, still pointed at the High Seas fleet, the ship continued to take hits as only her A turret was capable of firing back. She didn't land any hits with her rangefinder busted by this point, but she at least gave a good showing of herself. After this, with the Grand Fleet coming up fast and Warspite able to, more or less, steer again, the Germans broke off, unable to sink the battleship. Not for lack of trying. Warspite took no fewer than 15 heavy caliber hits, doing enough damage that she was at very real risk of sinking at one point. This isn't even taking into account dozens of hits from smaller caliber weapons, the secondary batteries of battleships and the like. That damage to her steering gear would remain a problem for the rest of her career, in spite of numerous attempts to fix it as well. A little gremlin and scar from Jutland that never went away. With the ship pretty well shot to ribbons at this point, Warspite was ordered back to port instead of rejoining the Grand Fleet. Her bad luck would continue here, mixed with a sprinkling of good luck. In spite of encountering at least 2 U-boats on the way back, no torpedoes would hit the ship. Probably a good thing, because Warspite was in no shape to take a torpedo hit at this point. The second submarine, caught on the surface, narrowly avoided getting rammed by the vengeful battleship as well. Once back in port, repairs to Warspite would continue for 2 months. With the ship back in proper shape, rudder issues aside, she rejoined the Grand Fleet, and did not much else of note for the rest of the Great War, other than contriving to ram another of her sister ships, this time Valiant. After repairs for that, her captain got shoved off to shore duty. Not that her new commander had much better luck wrangling his battleship, considering she then rammed a destroyer in June of 1917. Seriously, Warspite seems to get kicks out of ramming literally anything in sight. Those incidents, and a boiler fire aside though, she had a boring time for the rest of the war, what with the High Seas Fleet refusing to do a Jutland 2.0 and all. The next and last time Warspite would come in close contact with the Imperial German fleet was escorting the surrendered fleet to Scapa Flow and internment. After which, the 1920s were fairly uneventful for Warspite, as one could probably expect. She went in for a refit and partial modernization in 1924, which finished in 1926. This mostly involved trunking her funnels, changing her anti-aircraft battery a bit, and adding torpedo bulges. A pretty substantial change to her outward looks, but not by any means a major rebuild. She was immediately assigned to the Mediterranean upon completion of the refit, and promptly managed to hit a rock in the Aegean in 1927. Seriously, Warspite, watch where you're going. After repairs for that, she joined the Atlantic Fleet, where her magnetic collision field decided it wanted to have someone else ram her for a change. In 1933, in foggy weather, a Romanian passenger liner collided with Warspite. At least this time, the battleship came away with minor damage. Going in for modernization again in the 1930s, Warspite would be much more substantially rebuilt, if not to the same extent as Queen Elizabeth and Valiant would be later on. The most visible change was the new tower superstructure, something the Royal Navy had a bit of a love affair with at the time. This change in superstructure also saw facilities to operate floatplanes added to her, in addition to modifying her turrets for higher elevation, changing her anti-aircraft suite once again, and increasing armor protection. All of this added weight was counteracted by swapping out her entire power plant with a more modern and powerful system. In case you're wondering, no, this rebuild still didn't fix her rudder issues. Coming out of this as something of a midpoint between her more modernized sisters, she retained a portion of her initial 6-inch secondary battery, and her lesser refit ones, Warspite spent the rest of the pre-World War II years in the Mediterranean. With that front mostly quiet, however, she would be sent back to the home fleet after Royal Oak was sunk in port. It was because of this that she would be assigned to hit the German fleet at Narvik, Norway, in April 1940. The British, having fought an inconclusive battle with the Germans there, were raring to take a second chomp at it. After all, the first battle had seen destroyer losses on both sides. Except this time, instead of only destroyers, they were going to bring the big guns. Metaphorically and very literally. Her first contribution was her seaplane scout, a swordfish of all things, sinking the U-64. This was the first submarine to be sunk by air power in the war, which is a nice first for Warspite for once. More importantly, however, her floatplane would provide scouting and fire direction support during the naval action at Narvik. That support would, in large part, allow the British to absolutely wreck the German destroyers present in the harbor. 8 of them would be sunk in exchange for damage, some admittedly severe, to 3 British destroyers. Not a bad record. For her part, Warspite stuck around for some unimpressive shore bombardment duty before returning to first Scapa Flow and then to the Mediterranean. It was there that her most famous actions in the Second World War would come. First being the Battle of Calabria, which is also one of the first engagements between British and Italian fleets. Warspite's actions here came about largely because of reckless use of the ship, though they are no less impressive because of it. First, with British cruisers, light cruisers with 6-inch guns, being pressured heavily by the Italian 8-inch arms ships, Admiral Cunningham took Warspite up to support the cruisers. In so doing, he broke off from his supporting battleships, Malaya and Royal Sovereign. This left Warspite momentarily alone against 2 Italian rebuild battleships, which, while inferior to her in firepower, were still nothing to be ignored. Warspite decided to go, who cares about that, and land one of the longest range hits in history. Certainly the longest hit between 2 battleships. At about 24 kilometers, Warspite landed a single shell on Giulio Cesare. This blew out her rear funnel and reduced her speed dramatically. With 2 more battleships coming up, the Italians wisely broke off at this point, other than cruisers and destroyers. Attempts by the Regia Aeronautica to sink Warspite failed miserably, and the ship went about her business at this point. Following a short stint escorting HMS Illustrious for the strike on Taranto, the next major action for Warspite was the Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941. This battle is not the best showing for the Italian Navy, let's put it that way. The far more modern battleship Vittorio Veneto was hit by a carrier aircraft after menacing British cruisers, causing severe flooding and reducing her speed. She was out of the battle and lucky enough to withdraw without further damage. The same could not be said for the heavy cruiser Pola, also damaged in the airstrikes. Left powerless and stranded, the Italians sent 2 of her sister ships and a pair of destroyers to try and protect her. All this succeeded in doing was getting 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers sunk in quick succession, when the British, masters of night fighting and radar, snuck up on the Italians and blasted them to pieces under the glare of searchlights. Warspite, Valiant, and Barham did their duty, and then departed when it became clear the rest of the Italian fleet was long gone. Warspite's luck would run out again, however, in common with many British warships. Set up as a floating anti-aircraft battery to support the evacuation of Crete, she was hit hard by German bombers on May 22, 1941. Forced to withdraw because of this damage, Warspite had to go all the way to the United States because the British didn't have the ability to repair her at the time. And even at this point, America was playing favorites and refitting British capital ships in their own dockyards. Warspite would be in Bremerton, finishing up her repairs, during the attack on Pearl Harbor. She went on high alert in case the Japanese struck there as well, but when that never materialized, Warspite finished her repairs, returned to service, and went off to the Indian Ocean. Whereupon she spent a few months stumbling in the dark with the Japanese, neither side ever coming to blows. After a stint bombarding Madagascar when the Allies took it from Vichy France, she returned to the Mediterranean. The sum total at that time in the Indian Ocean was a lot of false starts, some shore bombardment, and reaching the milestone of 160,000 miles sailed in the war to that point. Her first role, once back in her old stomping grounds, was to support the landings on Sicily and Italy proper. Aside from issues with her steering, again, this was largely uneventful. Though on one high-speed run back to Malta to dodge air attack, Admiral Cunningham would, by complete accident, give her her most famous nickname. Operation well carried out, there is no question when the old lady lifts her skirts, she can run. Thus was born the Grand Old Lady of the Royal Navy. However, with Italy's surrender, Warspite would not fight the Regia Marina again. Instead, she would help escort the capital ships that escaped, and survived their escape, to Allied internment. First the pair of Vittorio Veneto and the now renamed Italia. Then the ships she had hit so long ago, Giulio Cesare. Make no mistake though, Italy may have surrendered, but Germany sure hadn't. In the process of once again providing shore bombardment duty, Warspite would be targeted by 3 of the new German guided bombs, the Fritz X. These same bombs had previously sunk the far more modern Roma. Warspite would fare better, insofar as she wasn't sunk outright. One bomb missed entirely, another exploded close enough to blast apart her torpedo bulge, and the third hit her directly. That one hit near her funnel, blasting through the ship and leaving a 20-foot hole in her bottom. This didn't sink Warspite, though the damage would remain for her entire career. For after being towed off for repairs, causing a bit of a scare when, at one point, she broke her lines and drifted sideways through the Straits of Messina, well, the repairs would consist of removing her remaining 6-inch guns and sealing that gaping big hole in her bottom by means of a concrete plug. There wasn't time or resources to properly repair her, and with that concrete plug, Warspite would sail to support the Normandy invasions. One of her boiler rooms and turrets remained out of action for this and would never be properly repaired. She did get more anti-aircraft guns, though. Not that it stopped her from being the first ship to fire during the Normandy operations, or, for that matter, stopping her from firing her entire load of ammunition twice over. Warspite seemed to be doing her utmost to hate the French coast out of existence. Such was the amount of shells fired during the course of this, that her guns were completely worn out, and she needed to replace them before she could return to trying to solo the entire German army. This necessitated her being the first battleship to sail down the Straits of Dover since the war began, with German shore batteries failing to do any damage. Though her old collide with everything imaginable field apparently decided she'd gone too long without hitting something, so she hit a mine on June 13th. This managed to wreck one of her propeller shafts, so that when Warspite got her guns replaced and entered back into bombardment duty, that was about all the Royal Navy considered her fit for. With only 3 functional turrets and 3 functional propeller shafts, she was down 1 turret and could only manage 15 or so knots. As a result, the rest of her active service consisted of sailing up and down the European coast with monitors, bombarding the coast heavily, but doing nothing more than that. By November 1944, having done her duty well, Warspite was taken out of active service. Too worn down and damaged to bother refitting for service in the Pacific, she would never fire her guns in anger again. In spite of efforts to preserve her as a museum, she would be sent to the scrappers in 1946. This is a shame, of course, in the same way it is for Enterprise. If there was ever a ship that deserved to be a museum, Warspite was most assuredly one of them. Alas, it was not meant to be, no matter how much historical value was lost. But, since this is Warspite, the story doesn't end with a meek trip to the scrapyard. When she was towed out in April 1947, she managed to get one final laugh in the face of death. She'd faced the High Seas Fleet, dueled the Italians, rammed her sister ships and everything else under the sea. She'd been bombed with conventional weapons and an early guided missile. She'd worn out her guns multiple times. Do you think the ship that did all of this was going to die easily? A combination of her stubborn refusal to go into the quiet night and her collide with everything field acting up once again had Warspite run aground. In a fierce storm, she slipped her tow lines and broke her anchor chain, first running aground, then refloating herself, then damaging or running aground the ships trying to pull her off. All of this resulted in getting her sunk in place off the beach, where she would remain scrapped in place. Warspite was going to die, but she was going to die on her own terms to the last. If there was ever a fitting end for the most decorated warship in the Royal Navy, she won 15 battle awards, this was it. And one final laugh of her desire to ram absolutely everything imaginable, I suppose. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you in the next one.